Rude billionaire throws napkin at black waitress. What she says next shocked the entire restaurant. The crystal chandeliers of the Montrose room cast dancing shadows across polished marble floors as Atlanta's elite gathered for what promised to be the business dinner of the year. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the restaurant's gold-trimmed entrance, their tinted windows reflecting the warm glow of street lamps. Photographers pressed against velvet ropes, cameras ready to capture the arrival of Vincent Langford, the man Forbes had dubbed the Midas Touch. Just 3 months earlier, Vincent stepped out of the lead vehicle with the practiced ease of someone born into power. At 52, his silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit worth more than most people's annual salary. Diamond cufflinks caught the light as he adjusted his tie, surveying the crowd of reporters and onlookers with the detached interest of a king observing his subjects. Behind him, a parade of executives, lawyers, and PR handlers emerged from the other vehicles, forming a protective bubble around their golden goose. "Mr. Langford, can you comment on the Meridian acquisition?" shouted one reporter. "Vincent, is it true you're expanding into African markets?" called another. He raised a manicured hand, silencing the crowd with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen, ladies, all questions will be answered inside. Tonight is about celebrating American enterprise at its finest." His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no without consequences. The hostess, a nervous young woman with perfectly straightened hair, nearly stumbled over her words as she greeted the party. "Mr. Langford, welcome to the Montrose room. Your private dining area is ready, sir." Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted like a theater before the curtain rises. Servers straightened their postures, managers whispered final instructions, and even the background music seemed to lower a respectful octave. The Montrose room wasn't just any restaurant. It was where deals worth billions were sealed over aged wine and conversations that could shift global markets. Keisha Holloway finished adjusting her black apron and took a steadying breath. At 28, she had been working at the Montrose room for 3 years, long enough to serve celebrities and corporate titans without batting an eye. But tonight felt different. The entire staff had been briefed twice about Vincent Langford's preferences, dietary restrictions, and, most importantly, his legendary impatience with what he considered substandard service. Remember, Susan, the head server, had warned during the pre-shift meeting. "He's known to get people fired if they so much as breathe wrong around him. Keep it professional, keep it quick, and whatever you do, don't make eye contact unless he addresses you directly." Keisha nodded along with the others, but something in her chest tightened. She had grown up hearing stories about men like Vincent Langford, men who believed their wealth gave them permission to treat others as disposable objects. Her grandmother Lorraine used to say, "Money don't make you better than nobody, baby. It just makes you louder." The double doors to the main dining room swung open, and Vincent's entourage swept in like a conquering army. He commanded the center of attention effortlessly, his voice booming across the restaurant as he regaled his guests with stories of his latest corporate victories. Keisha watched from the service station as he gestured expansively, Diamond watch catching the light with each movement. "The Meridian deal was child's play," Vincent declared, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "When you understand leverage the way I do, everything becomes negotiable. Everything has a price." His guests, a mixture of potential investors, board members, and carefully selected journalists, hung on his every word. Vincent thrived on this attention, feeding off the deference like a vampire drawing sustenance from blood. Keisha approached the table with practiced professionalism, water pitcher in hand. She had perfected the art of invisible service, present when needed, absent when not. But as she began filling glasses, Vincent's conversation caught her attention. "The key to success," he was saying, cutting into his appetizer with surgical precision, "is understanding that some people are leaders, and others are, well, they're meant to serve. It's the natural order of things." Several guests chuckled uncomfortably. Keisha's hand tightened on the pitcher handle, but she continued her work silently. "Take this place, for instance," Vincent continued, gesturing around the dining room. "Beautiful restaurant, exceptional food. But what makes it truly work? The people who know their place in the hierarchy. The servers, the kitchen staff, they understand they're part of a well-oiled machine. When everyone stays in their lane, magic happens. He looked directly at Keisha as she reached for his water glass, his pale blue eyes cold as winter sky. Isn't that right, sweetheart? The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Every person at the table felt it, the way he emphasized sweetheart like it was an insult wrapped in false kindness. Keisha met his gaze steadily, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Never let nobody make you feel small, baby. You got the same blood as kings and queens. I believe everyone has value, sir, she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised that the furniture had suddenly spoken. A few of his guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The journalist from Forbes pulled out her phone, sensing a story brewing. How refreshing, Vincent said, his smile sharp as a blade. Philosophy from the help. Tell me, sweetheart, what's your name? Keisha, sir. Well, Keisha, since you seem to have opinions about value and worth, perhaps you can tell us about wine. What would you recommend from their vintage selection? It was a trap, and everyone at the table knew it. Vincent was setting her up to fail, to embarrass herself in front of his important guests. He leaned back in his chair like a cat playing with a mouse, waiting for her to stumble over wine terminology she couldn't possibly understand. But Keisha surprised him. If you're looking for something to complement the lamb special, I'd suggest the 2015 Chateauneuf du Pape. It has enough body to stand up to the rosemary reduction without overwhelming the palate. Though if you prefer something with more earth notes, the 2018 Barolo would pair beautifully with the truffle risotto. The table fell silent. Vincent's smile faltered for just a moment, long enough for Keisha to see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. One of his guests, a wine enthusiast, nodded approvingly. Excellent recommendations, the man murmured. But Vincent Langford was not a man who tolerated being upstaged, especially not by someone he considered beneath his notice. His face darkened, the mask of civility slipping just enough to reveal the predator underneath. He picked up his linen napkin, crumpled it into a ball, and with deliberate malice, threw it directly at Keisha's chest. Know your place, waitress, he said, his voice cutting through the restaurant's ambient noise like a knife through silk. I didn't ask for a lecture. I asked for wine recommendations, not attitude from the help. The napkin hit Keisha's uniform and fell to the floor, landing at her feet like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversations at nearby tables died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen staff, visible through the service window, had stopped their preparations to stare. In that moment, with all eyes on her and Vincent Langford's cruel smile burning into her memory, Keisha Holloway made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She bent down, picked up the napkin, and looked Vincent directly in the eyes. Of course, sir, she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. I'll get that wine right away. But as she turned to walk toward the wine cellar, her mind was already racing back to a conversation she'd had with her mother just 2 weeks earlier, about some old papers they'd found in her grandmother's things. Papers with a very familiar name written across the top. Papers that might just turn Vincent Langford's perfectly ordered world upside down. The wine cellar's cool air hit Keisha's face like a splash of cold water, bringing clarity to the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. She stood alone among the towering racks of vintage bottles, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. The napkin incident had shaken her more than she cared to admit, but it wasn't just the humiliation that had her heart racing. It was the sudden, electric recognition that had struck her the moment Vincent said his full name earlier that evening. Langford. The name had been haunting her family for decades. 2 weeks ago, she and her mother had been cleaning out her late grandmother Lorraine's apartment, sorting through 60 years of accumulated memories. They had found it tucked away in an old shoebox beneath winter coats, a manila envelope marked, "Important papers do not throw away," in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "What's this, Mama?" Keisha had asked, holding up a yellow document that looked official and intimidating. Her mother, Denise, had taken the paper with shaking hands, her eyes widening as she read. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "I thought Mama had lost this years ago." Now, standing in the wine cellar with Vincent Langford's cruelty still burning in her memory, Keisha scrolled through the photos she had taken of that document. The letterhead was faded but still legible. "Private Financial Agreement Confidential." Below it, two signatures, Lorraine Holloway and Martin Langford. Martin Langford, Vincent's father. The story came flooding back to her, the story her grandmother used to tell during family gatherings, the one everyone thought was just another tall tale from an old woman who liked to embellish the past. But the document proved it was all true. In 1967, Martin Langford had been a struggling businessman with big dreams and empty pockets. His textile company was 3 months behind on rent, creditors were circling like vultures, and the bank had refused his loan application twice. He was one bad week away from losing everything. That's when he met Lorraine Holloway. Lorraine had been working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, taking in sewing during the day, and working weekends at a laundromat. She had saved every penny for 15 years, dreaming of opening her own dress shop. But when she saw Martin's desperation, when he came to her neighborhood looking for anyone willing to take a chance on him, her generous heart had overruled her practical mind. $5,000. Her grandmother had told the story. "That's what I gave him. $5,000 that was supposed to be my future. But he promised me something in return. He said when his company made it big, I'd get a piece of the pie. We wrote it all down, signed it proper, had it witnessed by Mrs. Johnson from next door." The family had always assumed the money was simply lost, a hard lesson about trusting the wrong people. Martin Langford's textile business had indeed become successful, eventually growing into the empire Vincent now controlled. But Lorraine never saw a penny of her promised return. Keisha's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby, I've been thinking about that contract. Maybe you should show it to a lawyer. Your grandmother never forgot about that money. She always said the Langfords owed us." Standing there among millions of dollars worth of wine, wearing a uniform that cost less than the cheapest bottle on the shelf, Keisha felt something shift inside her chest. The humiliation of the thrown napkin transformed into something else entirely, a burning sense of justice that had been decades in the making. She photographed the contract again, this time focusing on the fine print she had initially skipped over. Her breath caught as she read one particular clause. "In the event of non-payment within the agreed timeline, the lender or their legal successors shall be entitled to 15% of the debtor's business equity, calculated from the date of original investment and adjusted for inflation and compound interest." 15%. Of everything Martin Langford had built with her grandmother's money. Her hands shook as she did quick mental math. Vincent's company was worth billions now. 15% of billions was... "Keisha!" Susan's voice echoed down the cellar stairs. "Table 12 is asking for their wine. What's taking so long?" "Coming," Keisha called back, but her mind was spinning like a tornado. She grabbed the Chateau Neuf du Pape with trembling hands, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, baby. Sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning." As she climbed the stairs back to the dining room, Keisha felt like she was walking toward her destiny. Vincent Langford had thrown that napkin intending to put her in her place, to remind her that she was nothing more than hired help in his world. But he had no idea that the help he had just humiliated was the granddaughter of the woman who had saved his family's empire from bankruptcy. He had no idea that his father's unpaid debt was about to come due, with 60 years of interest. The dining room lights seemed brighter as she approached his table, the conversations louder, the stakes higher. Vincent was in the middle of another story about his business genius, gesturing with his wine glass as his audience hung on every word. "Success," he was saying, "is about knowing when to strike and when to wait. It's about patience, timing, and most importantly, knowing your opponent's weaknesses." Keisha set the wine bottle on the table with steady hands, her decision crystallizing like sugar in hot water. Vincent Langford was about to discover that sometimes your opponent has been waiting 60 years for the perfect moment to strike. And sometimes, they're standing right next to you, holding the very weapon that will bring down your empire. Vincent barely glanced up as Keisha returned with the wine, his attention focused on impressing a tech mogul who had flown in from Silicon Valley specifically for this dinner. The thrown napkin incident had already faded from his memory, just another moment of necessary discipline in his perfectly ordered world. The African expansion is going to triple our textile margins, Vincent declared, swirling the wine Keisha had poured with the practiced motion of a connoisseur. When you control the supply chain from raw materials to retail, you control the future. It's what my father always taught me: build the foundation strong, and the empire will stand forever. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Keisha as she moved silently around the table, refilling water glasses and removing empty appetizer plates. Vincent's father had indeed built strong foundations, with her grandmother's money, her grandmother's faith, and her grandmother's broken dreams. The Forbes journalist leaned forward, notebook ready. Mr. Langford, there are critics who say your rapid expansion comes at the cost of worker rights in developing nations. How do you respond to those allegations? Vincent's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Critics will always find something to complain about. I provide jobs, I create opportunity. The people working in our facilities are grateful for the chance to improve their lives. Sometimes tough love is necessary to build character. He gestured casually toward Keisha as she reached for his bread plate. Take this young lady here. Earlier tonight, she tried to lecture me about wine like she was some kind of sommelier. But after a gentle correction, she's performing her duties exactly as expected. That's how real leadership works. You establish boundaries, maintain respect, and everyone benefits. The table shifted uncomfortably. Several guests exchanged glances, clearly embarrassed by Vincent's casual cruelty. But no one spoke up. In Vincent Langford's world, challenging the host was career sabotage. Keisha felt every eye on her as she continued her work, but something had changed in the wine cellar. The shame and anger from earlier had transformed into something cooler, more focused. She thought of her grandmother's hands, worn rough from decades of hard work, signing that contract with hope in her heart. She thought of her mother, working double shifts to put her through community college, never knowing they had been owed millions all along. Mr. Langford, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a knife through butter. The table fell silent. Vincent's wine glass paused halfway to his lips, his pale eyes narrowing with irritation. Excuse me? I said, Mr. Langford, Keisha repeated, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I was wondering if you ever heard of a woman named Lorraine Holloway. The effect was immediate and electric. Vincent's face went completely white, as if all the blood had drained from his head in an instant. The wine glass trembled in his hand before he set it down with deliberate control. What did you say? Lorraine Holloway, Keisha repeated, reaching into her apron pocket. She was my grandmother. And according to this contract she signed with your father in 1967, your family owes mine quite a bit of money. She placed a laminated copy of the document on the table, right next to Vincent's dinner plate. The yellowed paper with its faded ink looked ancient and fragile, but the legal language was clear as crystal. Vincent stared at the contract like it was a venomous snake that had suddenly appeared on his table. His guests leaned forward, trying to read the document, but Vincent's hand shot out to cover it. This is impossible, he stammered, his usual confidence cracking like ice under pressure. My father never, there's no way. 15% equity stake, Keisha continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Plus compound interest over 57 years. I had a lawyer friend take a quick look at the numbers. With your company's current valuation, that comes to approximately $87 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Vincent's legal advisor, a sharp-faced man who had been silent all evening, suddenly came alive. He reached for the contract with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the document with professional intensity. Vincent, the lawyer whispered urgently, this has a binding witness clause. If this is authentic. It's not authentic, Vincent snapped, but his voice cracked on the words. This is some kind of scam, some elaborate con game. You can't just walk into a restaurant and claim my family owes you money. Keisha smiled for the first time that evening, and it was nothing like the polite, professional smile she had worn all night. This smile had teeth. I'm not claiming anything, Mr. Langford. I'm simply returning something that belongs to you. She picked up the crumpled napkin from earlier and placed it neatly beside his plate. You threw this at me to remind me of my place. Well, my place is right here, collecting on a 60-year-old debt. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every conversation had died. Every diner was staring at their table. Phone cameras were already recording, social media posts were being typed, and Vincent Langford's perfectly controlled evening was spiraling into chaos. This isn't over, he hissed, but the power had already shifted. The predator had become the prey, and everyone in the room could smell the blood in the water. Vincent's legal advisor, Marcus Chin, had built his career on finding loopholes in ironclad contracts and making problems disappear with carefully worded settlements. But as he studied the document under the restaurant's chandelier light, his face grew progressively paler. The other dinner guests watched in fascination as the most expensive lawyer in Atlanta began to sweat. Vincent, Marcus whispered urgently, pulling his client aside. We need to talk. Now. But Vincent was beyond reasoning. His empire, his reputation, his carefully constructed image of invincibility, all of it was crumbling because of a waitress with a piece of old paper. This is a fake, he declared loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. Some elaborate scheme to extort money from me. Keisha remained perfectly calm, her hands folded in front of her like a teacher addressing an unruly student. Mr. Chin, she said, looking directly at the lawyer. You're welcome to verify the document's authenticity. The contract was witnessed by Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, who lived at 1247 Auburn Avenue in 1967. Her granddaughter still has the original witness statement. The bank records from First National of Atlanta, now absorbed by your current bank, still show the wire transfer of $5,000 from Lorraine Holloway to Martin Langford on March 15, 1967. Marcus's hands shook as he examined the contract more closely. Every detail Keisha mentioned could be verified. The legal language was consistent with 1960s commercial agreements. The signatures looked authentic. Most damning of all, the binding clause was crystal clear. This agreement shall remain in effect until all terms are satisfied, and shall be enforceable by the legal heirs and successors of both parties. There's more, Keisha continued, pulling out her phone. According to Georgia commercial law, when a debt remains unpaid for over 20 years, the creditor has the right to claim compensation based on the debtor's current assets and earnings. Your father used my grandmother's money to purchase the original textile machinery that launched Langford Enterprises. Every dollar your company has earned since 1967 was built on that foundation. The Forbes journalist was frantically typing notes, her eyes bright with the scent of the biggest story of her career. Other diners had abandoned any pretense of privacy. Phones were out, videos were recording, and the whispered conversations were growing louder. Vincent grabbed the contract from Marcus's hands, his face twisted with rage. You want to play games? Fine. Let's talk about what really happened. Your grandmother was a loan shark who preyed on desperate businessmen. My father paid back every penny he owed. Then you'll have the receipts, Keisha replied smoothly. The contract requires written acknowledgement of payment. Where's your documentation? The question hung in the air like a sword above Vincent's head. He turned to Marcus, desperation creeping into his voice. The records from 1967. They're in storage somewhere, right? The company archives? Marcus avoided his client's eyes. Vincent, most companies don't keep detailed financial records from 57 years ago. And even if you did, Keisha interrupted. The contract includes a compound interest clause. At 8% annually, the legal maximum in Georgia in 1967, Your father's $5,000 debt has grown to approximately $12 million before we even calculate the equity stake. The math hit the table like a physical blow. $12 million in compound interest, plus 15% of a company now worth over $500 million. Vincent's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. But here's the really interesting part, Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. The contract specifically states that if the original business is sold or substantially altered without the creditor's written consent, the equity percentage doubles. According to my research, Langford Enterprises has been bought, sold, and restructured 17 times since 1967. Marcus's legal pad fell from his nerveless fingers. 30%, he whispered. 30% of $500 million, Keisha confirmed. That's $150 million in equity, plus the $12 million in compound interest, plus penalties for breach of contract. The restaurant had become completely silent except for the soft clicking of phone cameras and the scratch of the journalist's pen. Vincent looked around the table at his guests, investors who were already calculating how this scandal would affect their portfolios, board members who were mentally composing resignation letters, and media representatives who were crafting headlines that would destroy him. This is blackmail, Vincent snarled, but his voice had lost all its authority. Keisha smiled that same terrifying smile. No, Mr. Langford. This is justice. And unlike the napkin you threw at me, it's been 60 years in the making. She turned to address the entire restaurant, her voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with the present. As she walked away from the table, leaving Vincent surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, the only sound was the soft thud of his empire beginning to collapse. The first notification hit Vincent's phone at 11:47 p.m., just as he was storming out of the Montrose room's back exit to avoid the growing crowd of photographers. A Twitter alert. At Business Buzz, breaking, billionaire Vincent Langford confronted by Waitress over $162 million family debt at Atlanta restaurant. Video inside. Hashtag Langford Scandal. By midnight, the hashtag was trending nationally. The video had been captured by Jessica Martinez, a food blogger at Table 7 who had initially come to review the restaurant's new tasting menu. Instead, she had live-streamed the entire confrontation to her 50,000 followers. Within hours, the footage had been shared, reposted, and dissected across every social media platform. Oh my God, you guys! Jessica whispered into her phone as chaos erupted around Vincent's table. I'm literally watching a billionaire get served by his own waitress. She just dropped a bomb about some contract from the 1960s. This is insane. The video quality wasn't perfect, but the audio was crystal clear. Every word of Keisha's devastating revelation had been broadcast live to the internet, complete with Vincent's increasingly desperate denials and the shocked faces of his high-profile dinner guests. Back in his penthouse office, Vincent paced like a caged animal, while Marcus frantically made phone calls to damage control specialists. But the story was moving too fast, spreading too far. Major news outlets were already picking it up, financial bloggers were analyzing the implications, and worst of all, Langford Enterprises' stock price was beginning to fluctuate in after-hours trading. Sir, we need to get ahead of this, urged Patricia Webb, his head of public relations, who had been dragged out of bed at 1 a.m. for an emergency meeting. We need a statement, a counter-narrative, something to... There is no counter-narrative, Vincent roared, sweeping a stack of financial reports off his desk. Some nobody waitress just destroyed 40 years of work with a piece of paper. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in her modest apartment, Keisha sat at her kitchen table with her mother and her lawyer friend, David Kim, who had driven over as soon as he saw the viral video. The apartment was small but warm, filled with family photos and her grandmother's quilts, a stark contrast to Vincent's sterile corporate luxury. Baby, I can't believe you did that, Denise whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mama would be so proud. All those years she talked about that man's family, wondering if they even remembered her name. David was reviewing copies of additional documents that had been stored in a safety deposit box. Bank records, correspondence, even a faded photograph of Lorraine and Martin Langford shaking hands outside the original textile factory. "Keisha, this is airtight. I've never seen a more solid case. But you need to understand what's about to happen. Vincent Langford isn't going down without a fight." As if summoned by his words, Keisha's phone began buzzing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and investment firms. Word had spread through Atlanta's legal community like wildfire. By dawn, she had received 17 offers for representation, including calls from 3 of the city's most prestigious law firms. The morning news coverage was devastating for Vincent. Financial experts appeared on every major network, explaining how a 60-year-old debt could legally snowball into a 9-figure claim. The story had everything viewers loved: a powerful man's comeuppance, racial and class tensions, family secrets, and a David versus Goliath narrative that wrote itself. "What we're seeing here," explained CNN's financial correspondent, "is a perfect storm of legal oversight and compound interest. If this contract is authentic, and early reports suggest it is, then Vincent Langford's empire was literally built on borrowed money that was never repaid." But it was the emergency board meeting at 6 a.m. that delivered the blow. Vincent sat at the head of the conference table he had commanded for 15 years, facing 9 increasingly hostile board members who had been fielding angry calls from investors all night. "Vincent, the stock is down 18% in pre-market trading," announced board chairman Robert Hayes, his voice cold as winter. "We've got institutional investors threatening to pull out, 3 major clients reconsidering their contracts, and the SEC has already opened a preliminary inquiry. This will blow over," Vincent insisted, but his usual confidence was gone. "It's just media hysteria. Once people understand the facts." "The facts," interrupted board member Sarah Chin, "are that our company may owe $162 million to a woman who served us wine last night. The facts are that every financial decision you've made as CEO is now under scrutiny. The facts are that you've exposed this company to the biggest lawsuit in our history." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of protesters who had already gathered outside the building. Someone had organized a "Justice for Lorraine" rally overnight, complete with signs reading, "Pay your debts," and "Billionaires aren't above the law." Hayes cleared his throat. "Vincent, the board has called for an emergency vote of no confidence. Given recent events and the potential financial exposure, we believe it would be in the company's best interest if you step down as CEO, effective immediately." Vincent looked around the table at faces that had once shown him nothing but deference and respect. Now he saw only calculation, fear, and the cold arithmetic of corporate survival. These weren't friends or allies. They were sharks who had smelled blood in the water. "You can't do this to me," he whispered. "I built this company. I am this company." "No," Hayes replied, his voice final as a judge's gavel. "Apparently, Lorraine Holloway built this company. You just ran it into the ground." Outside, the protesters cheered as news of Vincent's resignation broke on social media. Keisha, watching from her apartment, felt her grandmother's presence in the room like a warm embrace. Justice, it seemed, had finally come home. 6 months later, the headlines had shifted from scandal to triumph. From waitress to CEO, Keisha Holloway's remarkable journey graced the cover of Forbes, the same magazine that had once celebrated Vincent Langford as a business genius. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The settlement negotiations had taken 3 months of intense legal wrangling, but Keisha's team, now led by one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms, had held firm. Vincent's lawyers had tried every trick in the book, challenging the contract's authenticity, questioning the compound interest calculations, even attempting to argue that the debt had passed the statute of limitations. But 60 years of meticulous record-keeping by 3 generations of Holloway women had created an unbreakable legal fortress. In the end, Vincent had no choice. Facing mounting legal costs, plummeting stock prices, and the complete loss of investor confidence, he agreed to a settlement that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Rather than the cash payout his lawyers recommended, Keisha had negotiated for something far more valuable, a 35% equity stake in what remained of Langford Enterprises, plus controlling interest in 3 of the company's most profitable subsidiaries. "I don't want his money," she had told her legal team during the final negotiations. "I want what my grandmother was promised, a piece of the business she helped build." The transformation had been swift and decisive. Keisha's first act as a major shareholder was to restructure the company's labor practices, implementing fair wage standards and worker protection programs across all international facilities. The moves that Vincent's team had predicted would bankrupt the company instead attracted a new wave of socially conscious investors, and stock prices began climbing again. But it was her second decision that truly shocked the business world. Using a portion of her settlement money, Keisha had quietly purchased 49% of the Montrose Room, the very restaurant where her confrontation with Vincent had begun. The previous owner, impressed by her story and the national attention it had brought to his establishment, had offered her the partnership himself. "This place represents something important," Keisha explained to the Atlanta Business Journal. "It's where my grandmother's legacy finally got the respect it deserved. I want to make sure it remains a place where everyone, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity." The restaurant had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, with visitors from around the world coming to see where the "Napkin heard round the world" incident had taken place. Table 12, where Vincent had sat that fateful night, now featured a small bronze plaque. "In honor of Lorraine Holloway, 1929 to 2019, entrepreneur, visionary, and grandmother extraordinaire." But Keisha's proudest achievement was the launch of Lorraine's Legacy, a fashion tech startup that combined her grandmother's sewing expertise with cutting-edge sustainable manufacturing. The company specialized in creating high-quality clothing while maintaining ethical labor practices and environmental responsibility, everything Vincent's empire had never been. "My grandmother always said that how you treat people when you have power shows who you really are," Keisha told the packed auditorium at her TEDx Atlanta talk. She treated a desperate businessman with kindness and generosity. It took 60 years, but that kindness finally came full circle. The audience gave her a standing ovation, but the moment that truly mattered to Keisha had come later, in the quiet of her new corner office in downtown Atlanta. The space was a perfect blend of modern elegance and family history, her grandmother's antique sewing machine displayed prominently next to state-of-the-art computers, family photos mixed with business awards. And there, hanging in a place of honor behind her desk, was the napkin. Vincent's crumpled napkin, the one he had thrown at her in contempt, now sat in an elegant frame with a simple brass plaque. "Power can be borrowed. Respect must be earned." Below it, a smaller inscription read, "In memory of Lorraine Holloway, who taught us that every seed of kindness eventually grows into a harvest of justice." Keisha often caught herself staring at that napkin during long business meetings, remembering the weight of it hitting her chest, the shock and humiliation she had felt in that moment. But now it represented something entirely different, proof that no act of cruelty, no matter how small, exists in a vacuum. Every choice has consequences, every action creates ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. Vincent Langford had learned that lesson the hard way. Last she had heard, he was living in a modest condo in Tampa, his fortune depleted by legal fees and the company's buyout of his remaining shares. He had tried to start a consulting business, but his reputation preceded him wherever he went. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now couldn't get a meeting with mid-level executives. Sometimes, late at night when the city lights twinkled beyond her office windows, Keisha would think about calling him. Not to gloat or to rub salt in old wounds, but to thank him. After all, if he hadn't thrown that napkin, if he hadn't been so convinced of his own superiority, her grandmother's contract might have remained buried in a shoebox forever. But then she would remember her grandmother's words. "Baby, the best revenge is a life well lived." Lorraine Holloway's granddaughter was living very well indeed. The napkin would remain in its frame, a reminder that justice, like compound interest, grows more powerful with time. And sometimes, it arrives exactly when it's needed most, served with a side of dignity and a generous helping of long overdue respect.